Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutler.
And today we're going to talk about, I think, primarily the film work of the master of the Viewisk universe. You see what I did there? Kevin Smith.
Yeah, it's the very prolific director who's been around in some form since the 90s.
Yeah, I mean, the first, I think, available piece of his work is Mayday, the Crumbling of a Documentary, which is from 1992. It's when Kevin Smith was in film school, which he did not stay in, famously.
And it was in Canada, too. That's important.
Yeah. Oh, that's going to come back a lot. But, you can watch that on the Clerks 10 DVD if you can track that down. I don't know if that is expensive these days. Some of Kevin Smith's catalog is kind of difficult to track down on video these days, but that is featured on there. It is what it says it is, the crumbling of a documentary. But I think most of the world first heard of Kevin Smith in 1994 for Clerks. Clerks shot for under $30,000, which is pretty impressive. Goes to gross $3 million. And generally, still to this day, pretty well received. Eventually released fairly wide by Miramax Films.
I think it's also important to note that, how he started this production. This is him dropping out of film school, then going to make his own feature film. But he did this by selling his comic book collection back when he could sell it for a couple grand, like he did. I mean, that's not really possible anymore unless you own X-Men #1 or something.
Yeah, I think, it might be possible. It'd be hard to find a buyer. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to sell comic books. Most places are pretty picky unless they're going to give you a really low price. But, I mean, that's nature of the beast with that. He also maxed out all of his credit cards.
Yes.
Essentially betting everything he had and didn't have on this movie.
It did really well. I think it's a really unique movie to see Clerks because we'll get into what defines him as a director, but it's the fact that it's a black and white. It came out right at the height of the indie film boom, where you suddenly see all these indie films going through the festival circuit and then coming out as big blockbusters. And Clerks really helped start that alongside Sex, Lies, and Videotapes.
Yeah, it's that whole era, and I think it's important to note that too, that the era in which Kevin Smith's films are coming out, which the first few are pretty rapid fire, is an era very receptive to indie filmmaking, and I would say dialogue heavy. I don't know, would you call Clerks a dramedy? I kind of hate that word, but it's really the best thing I can think of.
It kind of is. I think his later films are more dramedy. Dramedy, I think it's like Spanglish or something. It feels tacky to call Kevin Smith stuff dramedy.
Yeah, I feel like maybe Clerks is a comedy that has some sobering elements. Clerks has many characters, most of which were cast from Kevin Smith's group of friends. It does largely focus on the two titular clerks, Randall and Dante. Most of the comedy in the film is kind of centered around their conversations of pop culture, which I think is also sort of a very big 90s indie boom trend.
Yeah, that's really what helps define Kevin Smith, is that he's very into pop culture. I think he really refines it later on in his career, but this is the first time you really see people talking about Star Wars and things like that. You had it sometimes in other films, but this felt like a really nerdy conversation, which is something you did not see in films beforehand, where people would be arguing about the Death Star and things like that. Well, before it might be just a reference to lightsabers or something.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point to make too, is especially Star Wars. Like I was saying, there is a lot of this in this era. Kevin Smith, all kind of turn to big pop culture focal points in their films to help move it along and to help make it relatable. And a lot of people, have kind of theorized this is a really big Generation X thing, basically because, that whole Generation X label came from the fact that, that's a generation that doesn't really have a war, that doesn't really have a giant social upheaval. Pop culture was kind of their playground.
Yeah, it's a good. The MTV generation is also what it was called too. I mean, it was just a different pop culture atmosphere, and Clerks was kind of the beginning of this like reaction to that, where people were just kind of discussing it. While beforehand, it was more like reacting to Vietnam, World War II, things like that, big events like that. And this was a much more like beginning of individualized experiences.
Right, and even a little before that, like the film brats, the late 70s, early 80s, they were really focusing on getting away from those heavy themes in some ways and doing more fun films again. And now we're kind of back to social commentary, but in a very different world. Clerks also introduces Jay and Silent Bob, another recurring theme Kevin Smith's films. Smith saying, later that he chose the role of Silent Bob for himself because he thought it would be too hard to direct himself doing really funny dialogue as Randall.
Yeah, that sounds about right, but I think it turned out well. Well, Jay and Silent Bob are kind of like, we'll get into them later on because they become more and more prominent, but like, they're interesting that they begin in like Kevin Smith's first, or really his first film, Clerks, in that it's like they're a pop culture icon through like sheer attrition through Kevin Smith, like running the film circuits and comic book conventions.
I think, one of the things though that does get overlooked now, there's also their pop culture relevance. And they're pretty funny if you can track them down. They're not always in the best quality because Viacom is like terrible with releasing things. But yeah, that they definitely became something even separate from Kevin Smith's work, which is funny because they're part of it. So Clerks does incredibly well. And, as we were saying, like this was an era where Hollywood was very receptive to these indie directors. And this film particularly, I always think is interesting because, a lot of them go with the dark endings, and Kevin Smith had shot an ending wherein Dante is dead at the end of it, which is supposed to be like the ultimate payoff of the I'm not even supposed to be here today. But he decided not to do that. He decided to go with the sort of happier ending, which I think in a lot of ways saves Clerks, and it makes it still work a lot better than some of those films now.
I would agree. I think that would be too dark. I mean, it would be very funny to Kevin Smith, but it kind of seems like a joke that's only funny to your group of friends and would not play well to anybody else.
But ultimately, Clerks Clerks in a lot of ways is like an extended discussion of sort of Generation X creative aimlessness, as other films are as well. I would say Reality Bites is probably the big budget version of that commentary. But it is really well received, gets its share of festival viewings, and Smith gets the attention of Jim Jacks, who's working with Universal at the time, who also had picked up Richard Linklater to do Dazed and Confused. And we move on to the second film in the View Askew universe, Mallrats. You know what, Christian? I want you to talk about this first because of our age difference. I want to know what your impression of Mallrats is, because I feel like I'm going to have a very different perspective on this.
Mallrats is like a weird experience because like we said, there's about like a 10-year difference between us. So like my mall experiences were all like with like emos and like Hot Topics and like the food court and things like that. The food court thing is still like tied together, but like I had I didn't dislike this film, but it was kind of like hard for me to relate to any of it because it's like comic book stores are just not a thing for like me. Like I have to drive to some special location and not the mall. Like it was just a very different experience to me. Even like events at the mall, that didn't happen for me like back then. Like they basically stopped doing events at our local malls over here in like 2002. So it was a very interesting experience to me in that way. But like, it's also like this is Kevin Smith's big budget version of Clerks, and it either works for you or it doesn't. I think in that way.
Yeah, I think it's a lot, and he's kind of talked about this too. To me, it's very much his shot at that sort of over the top '80s comedy. There's a little bit of sex comedy in it. There's a little bit of stoner comedy.
Quite a lot.
Yeah, but it's like a mix.
Blowjob in an elevator.
But like it's not the centerpiece of the film as it would be in like a Porky's or something.
Yeah, no, it's not American Pie, which is also coming around this time too.
Yeah, it's interesting that you see that's where our perspectives are a little different because I see like American Pie is like way later, which is wrong. It's not true. It is pretty. But like Mallrats for me was I think probably the first one I saw. If almost definitely is the first one I saw because there were TV airings that were heavily edited and then I did eventually see the R cut. But it's funny because I had referenced the late Jim Jackson before as a producer on this. He had spoken about it because he also produced Dazed and Confused, and he said that Linklater and Smith actually shot very similarly, like not a lot of coverage and kind of like seat of their pants. But the results were very different. I think is interesting here, and this is something that maybe has an impact on that maybe changed the tone more than we even realize, is Kevin Smith did not edit Mallrats, where he would basically edit almost all of the other units are edited by Kevin Smith. He did
That
not
explains
edit
a
Mallrats.
lot. That explains a lot about Mallrats because it does feel very like 80s comedy. I know he was trying to go for that tone, but usually there's a bit of a like self-referential tone to it, even to like his later stuff. And here, none, none of that's there except for maybe the Stan Lee moment where where Stan Lee cameos, and then there's that weird moment where he's talking about, oh, what does Ben's grim dick look like, instead of getting relationship advice from Stan Lee.
This is something that I wanted to bring up. I wrote about this in length for Den of Geek a few years back too. Kevin Smith actually read the article. I know that because he retweeted about it, which was like one of the coolest things that's ever happened since I did any work on the internet. Mallrats 2, though, and this is definitely a generational thing here, is, let's say Mallrats comes in 1995. I didn't see it in theaters. I was 9. I probably saw it on TV around like 1996. This was like the first time that I saw adults talking about comic books and like knowing stuff that I knew from like reading profile books and things like that. And it was really on like the edge of me starting to read comics. So it was this weird thing where it was like felt like the only movie that existed at the time that knew what I was interested in.
See, I had a very different experience. Like, I was growing up with American Pie, and that had like jokes about like internet sex chat rooms and things like that, and that was kind of what I was like relating. Like, I wasn't into. We talked about this before, where like I wasn't into comic books until quite a while later. So like even me watching this movie much later in my life, it was like it wasn't like a profound experience as like many Kevin Smith's movies were like in when they first came out.
Yeah, I think it is profound in a weird way. Like it's not like it we're gonna get into Chasing Amy and Dogma and all those. But Mallrats was probably as important to my development watching films as anything else, which is a weird thing to say because I don't think it's like the greatest movie ever made. I think there's a lot of bizarre choices, and like we said, like Kevin Smith wasn't editing it, so I think maybe some of the takes that ended up in that movie weren't what he would have gone with, or he may have just excised entire things. But it's still super important, and I think, like I said, it was the first time I ever remember seeing any bit of that culture that I had kind of started to like get into a little bit as a preteen, like played out in front of me. It bombs terribly.
Yeah, Kevin Smith is not made for like what the kind of budget they were giving him for. Like this is kind of a common mistake movie companies do to this day, in which they inflate like this massive budget and expect massive returns. And like Kevin's films, movies are like niche. They're like for comic book fans and things like that. And expecting like a big audience out of that, I think, was the first big mistake. And both Kevin Smith and like movie companies learned a lot from that after this film.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's also very, very quick release-wise, close to Clerks. It's 94 for Clerks, 95 for Mallrats. So he really had to dive like head first into this project. So, while he never seems to quite slow down, even like that extra couple of months he might have had otherwise might have helped. So, we have Mallrats come out, it bombs. It's not really, it's definitely not a critical success. It does find its audience, I would say pretty quickly because, like I said, that's when I was really developing into reading comics and stuff, and everyone knew Mallrats and they all knew Snoochie Boochies, and that's probably what that movie does the most going forward, is really establishes Jay and Silent Bob. Jay and Silent Bob in the first one are drug dealers who then Silent Bob speaks and he's sage. Like in Mallrats, you get the really like comedic Jay and Silent Bob, where it's like he's our wacky adventurers who like you don't even understand the stuff they get into, and like it plants that seed with the rest of their movies.
Yeah, I suppose that's true because you see like Silent Bob doing the whole Batman thing where they're trying to destroy the stage and everything, and there's a bunch of like comic book references during that moment.
yeah, there's definitely like that really heavy reference to like the '89 Batman, which still would have been like super relevant, which is probably how they like got it past like Universal. Like Universal like executives understood that joke. Um, but then they get into, like you were saying, the Ben Grimm Dick discussion. They get into like Superman sex discussions, and like stuff like that was nowhere. Like there weren't enough people who understood what you were talking about to understand that. They do a Berserker Rage joke, what, 5 years before X-Men's on screen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, at least he had the animated show, but they weren't like most people knew just like Batman and Superman at this point. It wasn't this big like what we have now with Marvel and all this shit where like everybody knows everything. You can find out any little detail you need to.
Yeah, and that's really the difference. Is I think it's less that you know more people going in know. It's now you can just turn around and look it up if you don't know, and you know where to look it up. Like there were definitely resources where you could have looked up Superman facts, but most people didn't have the encyclopedia of the superheroes sitting on their desk in 1995. So like Smith probably takes a little bit of a hit. This happens a lot on sophomore films where like the second one just doesn't do as well, even if it gets a lot of attention later on. I would say like M. Night Shyamalan's a good example of that, where he goes from The Sixth Sense to Unbreakable, and now Unbreakable's really well liked, but at the time it didn't do well.
Yeah, I mean, M. Night Shyamalan's career is also a very strange beast too.
Yeah, it's a bizarre one. That's actually I'll link that in the description. We have an article about M. Night Shyamalan that we did for the site a couple of years back, where I kind of go through every little step of that career, and it is. I ended up really liking him by the end of all that research, but holy crap, is that a weird career? Um, but I think and that's it's not completely off base to compare them though, because what you see here is where Kevin Smith kind of chose a direction and stuck with it. Shyamalan didn't, and maybe that's part of the reason Smith has endured a little bit, is because maybe we do kind of know what we're getting a bit when we go to see a Kevin Smith movie, but we're there, so we wanted it.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because M. Night Shyamalan is very like scattershot, but he was originally known for plot twists, which is something he tried to veer pretty heavily away from later on, and now he's kind of leaned back into that. While Kevin Smith, I feel like, has kind of bounced back and forth between like, oh, I'll do a horror film now, or do like a drama film now, or do like a thriller film now, and then he'll go back to like Jane Silent Bob or like something that's very familiar. Like he had that whole stretch of his career where he was trying out all these other different film experiments.
Yeah, which is interesting because we're about to start to get into, I think, like prime Kevin Smith right now in our discussion. He takes that hit on Mallrats. He kind of shrinks back into the indie realm again after working with a pretty big release Universal for 1997's Chasing Amy. I think it's his best film. This many years, 25 years later, I think it's his best film, nearly. I also think it is him kind of going like, hey, I tried to do like the light, goofy version of like comic book culture in Mallrats, and Chasing Amy. Chasing Amy to this day reminds me of the first conventions I went to. It just feels right. It's the right type of players. It's the right culture because it was his culture. And then he drops in like a really complicated love story into all of it.
Yeah, this is definitely my favorite film. I try to avoid saying like the best film or whatever because it's all subjective in many many ways. So for me, it is my favorite film because it's something like I can put on any time and be happy with. Because unlike Dogma, where that's pure comedy, this one is something that like it just feels comfortable to watch. It feels very relatable. Again, like I did not grow up in the comic book scene at this point, but like something about the relationship and all the characters in this feels very relatable in that way. Is like they're all making really dumb decisions all the time, and which is maybe like a late teenage, early 20s experience, even late 20s experience for these guys were, and them trying to make careers and everything. I don't know. It's just a very it's just a very good film. It's hard to describe beyond that because it also has a lot of these '90s motifs in them about like being able to live in a loft and make a comic book and have that comic book be successful.
Yeah, I agree with you pretty much with everything you just said, and I would also agree with that. Yeah, like best film is hard to say because I don't think it's possible for anyone who's sort of into comic book stuff and all these things to be like super objective with any of these. But I think you hit on something there with what makes Chasing Amy work. Is Chasing Amy has some of the most natural comedy I've ever seen in a movie. You feel like you're watching a group of friends talk, even though it's fake. Like like the jokes that are made are valid. Like, and I think that's where a lot of the strength is derived from. Is like Smith is extremely deliberate. He has the story where he's trying to tell his love story where someone falls in love with a woman who, I think ultimately we're going to decide that she's bisexual, but, at the time he meets her is saying that she is a lesbian. And he takes that, surrounds it with a really, really complete setting, something he was super familiar with, so he could write about it without it being forced in any way. Like, it was probably effortless for him to write about, like, comic book writers talking to each other. And then he works in his comedy through what the characters are saying to each other. And the way they're saying it and the way they're meeting feels really realistic. And also, he sets it where he grew up. It's just all these things, all these little elements that bring up the validity of everything in the movie. And it gets over occasionally stiff dialogue and some pretty verbose scenes by doing that.
Yeah, even small things like them talking about not wanting to drive into New York City because it takes like an hour and a half. Like, that's an extremely Jersey thing.
Right, it feels really right. I mean, we can say that, right? Yeah. We both grew up in this area, and yeah, he kind of nails the idea of like, oh, I don't want to go to the city, not tonight. Like, but it's those touches. It's like that. The situation, I guess, is not. It's not like super unrealistic. It's like a little unlikely. With all like the moving gears, where it's like, oh, they're gonna sell this concept and make $1 million while they're making this comic, and then there's creative differences. Like, it's all things that it's accelerated reality. It's like little pieces of things that probably wouldn't happen at the same time, but are happening all together. But he holds it together so well in this one.
Yeah, I mean, like some of the weaknesses of Kevin Smith's films, like the acting and like you said, the overall dialogue, kind of fade away in this one. Like, there's still moments where I'm like, oh, these feel like just actors at points, like actors acting. Uh, that feels like a very bizarre description, but like the sense of reality sometimes fades away, and you kind of realize, oh, these are people acting on a soundstage. This doesn't really happen in that film, which is interesting. It happens a lot in Clerks. Like, Randall's acting feels very stiff, and you're kind of like, oh, he's just saying these lines. He's reading off of his script. And
Yeah, and there's definitely like a bit of structure to that too, but whether it was intentional or not, by the time you get to Ben Affleck's like monologue, like in the car, you've already invested enough in the characters where like you don't care about it. Like, if you started off with something like that, it would be unbearable. But it's the correct type of storytelling. Like, it's structured well, and it really brought back a lot of faith to Kevin Smith after that. Like, I remember that. So I would have been 11, 12 at the time. I used to watch a show called The Anti-Gravity Room, which has gotten name dropped as many times as I possibly can on Dissecting Fiction projects. Because this was this just weird Canadian comic book show that used to be on Sci-Fi Channel. And I remember them talking to Kevin Smith about Chasing Amy and how like exciting it was to have a movie that like they felt like represented their culture, which at the time didn't ever happen.
No, it didn't, and it arguably hasn't really happened since Kevin Smith. Like, it's so hard to capture that comic book culture feeling, and only Kevin Smith is really able to do that. You see, like, I don't know, I can't even think of another film that set itself inside of like a comic book confession that wasn't made by Kevin Smith.
Right. So next, for Kevin Smith, he takes another like real harsh left turn. Jay and Silent Bob once again appear. They did appear in Chasing Amy, but their roles are significantly reduced in that. I think that was more Kevin Smith having that sort of comic book mentality where it's like, this is the same universe. I got to have some kind of connecting fabrics. And for that one, Jay and Silent Bob come in, and Silent Bob tells the story that leads to the title Chasing Amy. The next film, budgets go up again. Distributed by Lionsgate, we get Dogma.
So Dogma's kind of been mysteriously missing from a lot of the catalogs of Kevin Smith because it was released by Weinstein's company, and nobody wants to buy any of the property from the infamous Weinstein. So it's kind of now sitting in this weird like limbo in somebody's like garage somewhere.
Yeah, there's lots of weird things. Like occasionally, when there's legal entanglements, you lose movies. Fright Night Part Two has a lot to do with the Menendez murders. That's true. It's like there's
Yeah, I
like
know.
a lot of weird stuff like that. What's interesting about Dogma is Dogma was something that Smith was working on before he started Clerks.
Re-
Um,
How do you mean that? Was he working on the script before this, or was he like?
yeah, he had been working on the script. He had kind of jotted down a scene with the 13th Apostle Rufus and had added serendipity, but didn't have like Jay and Silent Bob around yet. By the time he got to Clerks, he kind of knew he wanted to do it, which is why at the end of Clerks it says Jay and Silent Bob will return in Dogma, because he kind of knew where he was going with it. You know, once he's able to kind of get back into the good graces of Hollywood enough to get a big enough budget after Chasing Amy, he gets to make what could have been the second View Askew film, it sounds like. So Dogma gets a fair bit of promotion through controversy. It plays with a lot of very specific religious themes, I think is the best way to put it, right?
Yeah, very Catholic. Specifically Catholicism. I mean, this is about like angels coming down, and it's a lot of poking fun at the hypocrisy of Catholicism. Like you have the whole Buddy Jesus thing, which is still like a meme to this day, and it's still just funny looking at the Buddy Jesus like statue and everything. It's just like
Yeah.
it's just a lot of like small things, like oh, we're hip and cool Catholics and everything.
Yeah, there was like a weird thing with that too. And, you know, there was a lot of times people have this weird conception that like the church itself will go after movies and things. And that's usually not the case. There were a lot of like private Catholic groups that were going after the film. There's an opening scroll in the movie that definitely addresses that as much as it can.
Yeah, I mean, this is also like I remember when the Da Vinci Code came out, and they had the similar kind of controversy too, where like there's a lot of like uh people trying to protest it as being a offensive instead of just taking it as is as like a comedy.
Yeah, and I thought that was always the funniest part is, you know, it's a joke, especially in this one. It's a joke. It's not real. If you don't believe that, I hope you don't believe what happens in Dogma. Um, it was written by a guy from New Jersey and it's supposed to be a comedy. But it's, you know, you anytime if you pick any subject that you know is going to ruffle feathers, you're going to end up with this reaction. I don't think Smith was shocked. I think he might have been a little shocked with how strong that reaction was. Specifically, the organization they refer to themselves as the Catholic League. Like I said, not part of any church, just a group that organizes on its own. They've gone after other films in the past as well. But I think Dogma, for a lot of people, was where they learned about Jay and Silent Bob, which is interesting to me because I had already known at that point. That was a movie that at the time I could not get into a rated R film, but my dad took me. So I was already like ready to go. But I think Dogma is where the door sort of opens for that sort of second wave of Jay and Silent Bob popularity.
I didn't think of it about it like that because I was so familiar with like them from Clerks and everything instead of like or even like the Clerks animated show, which I still love. Yeah, Dogma is definitely his like funniest film, and it's just interesting to hear that yeah maybe Jay and Silent Bob for most people is associated with Dogma, where there's Loki and Ben Affleck and everything and Matt Damon.
Yeah, I mean, it brought attention to it. I know a couple of people who weren't really into comics or anything. A lot of them went back and watched the other ones because they thought it was funny. I'd agree with you as far as probably the best structured of the comedies. Like the jokes are jokes and they work really well. And if we're going like bigger budget, more complicated production, this is probably the highlight of his career. Just everything about it, you know, like really good performance, really good cast, and like you said, genuinely funny. And to clarify a little bit, I was able to kind of find how we were going. Apparently, Bob and Harvey Weinstein own the rights personally, and that's the problem. Is it wasn't done through their companies, which you know would allow it to be moved. They personally own the rights, which is why it is no longer in print and is not streaming anywhere. I happen to be a weirdo, and I own both the DVD and the Blu-ray. Neither of which I paid much for, so I feel smart. But yeah, it has been out of print entirely since 2008.
Yeah, it's. I did not know it was them personally owning the copyright. That's a weird situation for a film.
Yeah, it's extremely bizarre because usually you don't even want to own a film personally, just for like legal reasons. It makes it hard to do anything. Case in point. But it is funny that sort of this bigger budget film with a really well known cast is the one that you can't get.
Yeah, his probably biggest star cast until his most recent film.
And moving forward, so the Dogma was in 1999. Like I said, there's very little turn really anywhere in Smith's career. I think the biggest gap is 3 years with features. He's
Yeah,
been
with
pretty
features,
consistent.
but he's doing stuff between them too. Like he's always active with at least something.
2001 is Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. I think this kind of bolsters the argument that I was just making that, Dogma is really where Jay and Silent Bob become like that sort of second phase of popular where they're either known. You have a lot of characters coming back from all the films, and this is intended to be the cap on the view.
Yeah, I can see that because this is like a very Looney Tunes esque, where it's kind of like it feels very vaudeville, and that you just have a bunch of people showing up and being like, "Oh, here I am." It's like Looney Tunes in a way, which I think he did better in the Clerks animated show, which, like I just said, is brilliant and everyone should watch it.
What's funny about this too is this is after like Mallrats had gained that fan base, so they're wrapping up the story from Mallrats that we get Suzanne, and it's sort of that movie. He plays off of little elements of everything that was dropped into the other ones, but it is an interesting movie. It is kind of, I guess, almost what he was going for with Mallrats, and maybe pulls it off a little more commercially successful. I don't know if it's necessarily better overall, but it's certainly more successful than that film. And I think, he does pull it off to a certain extent. It's definitely a good movie.
It's just not my type of comedy because I'm not like a big like I guess like fart joke guy. Or even like monkeys. Like I never got the appeal of monkeys, and there's a whole like co-star of a monkey in this.
Well, yeah, but they had to pay that off from Mallrats, right? Like many of his films, it started off as and kind of shifted over to an R after some key cuts. But it is, Jay and Silent Bob Strikes Back is what it's supposed to be. It ends with God, Chris Morissette from Dogma, closing the book on the View Askew universe because it's over, right? We're not going to get any more. There are no more. And Smith then jumps back into the system a little bit and comes back with Jersey Girl, which would then be the first film he ever directed that was not supposed to be films.
This is one of the ones without James Silent Bob, which is kind of interesting in that like he's he is Silent Bob, so him not even appearing in his own film is kind of unique, especially after like a decade of doing that. And I guess this is supposed to be like his big breakaway. Like, well, I'm done with all the comic book stuff. I'm supposed to be. I'm going to try to do something a bit more commercial, and this is this attempt at that.
Yeah, and it's starring his buddy Ben Affleck. You get Jennifer Lopez in there. You get Jason Biggs, Liv Tyler. These were not huge minor names in 2004.
They were like the biggest stars in 2004.
They were big. And it. Okay, this is where we get into this like Hollywood stuff. This is by far to this day his biggest budget, primarily because of that cast. I would assume it came in at 30, only made $36.1 million, which we know after promotion means it lost money.
Yes, usually you double the budget in order to include promotion. Usually,
I found a little bit of information. $10 million for Affleck, $4 million for Lopez.
Jesus, it's in 2004.
Yeah. But it's I don't know if I think very few people have seen it. This is another one that is very difficult to track down on video at this point. It's just not around too much. I mean, if you want it, it's probably not super expensive, but it's not one of the ones you see. I actually I saw it in like a Walmart for $5 and I should have bought it. There is apparently an extended R cut, which is the cut that Kevin Smith really wanted, but they cut him down to PG-13, which might be sort of the first signs of what was going on behind the snes there.
Yeah, it's cutting Kevin Smith down to like from an R to PG-13 is probably like the biggest mistake he can do, because most of Kevin Smith's comedies rated R. Like Chasing Amy, every other line has fuck in it, you know.
And it is sort of that, I'm sure that's how a lot of the dialogue was written. And then if you kind of take the balls off of it, it's not good. They did show that R cut at Vulgarthon, which used to be his film festival in 2005, 2006. Not seeing too much information on if people. It's an interesting thing. It sounds also like Jennifer Lopez was supposed to be in it more, and after Geely didn't do well, they cut her a little more. This is a very studio-controlled film from all indications. So Jersey Girl, unfortunately, kind of fizzles as well. Like, his second big studio film doesn't do it. So he goes back to The Well, as I remember him saying frequently in this period, and does Clerks 2, which sounds a little weird because isn't that supposed to be done now? Aren't we not doing that anymore?
You know what? This is the first time I saw a Kevin Smith film. My first Kevin Smith film was Clerks 2.
That's a weird place to start. Did you go, man, I don't really care about Clerks 1?
No, I had just heard it was really raunchy, and this is kind of the age of like raunchy comedies. Like this is, American Wedding, American Pie, that whole series. And my mom, I think she had to do a business meeting, so she dropped me and my friends off at like a movie theater, and it was like a 2-hour movie, and that's how I saw it. Because she's like, just go see a movie. We decided to go see Clerks 2 because it got a lot of press of being like this really raunchy comedy, mainly because of the donkey show scene.
Oh
and,
boy! Yeah.
So we saw that, and I think I'm fine now.
Yeah, no, I don't think it affected you. I don't.
But
Clerks 2, once again, like this is another. Kevin Smith gets a lot of criticism, and I think like we're waging, I think, a little bit of fair criticism here and there at his filmmaking. But here he goes again. Budget of $5 million. Your only real name in the film is Rosario Dawson. He turns that $5 million into a $27 million box office. It's a funny movie. I would say Clerks 2 is like the first sign of what the whole View Askew thing turned into.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, this is my introduction to it, but like when I saw it again after watching Clerks 1 and 2, like the dialogue is very different because it really ramps up like the raunchiness of everything, and it tries to go away from the comic book stuff. And I guess in that way it was a bit more commercial. That was also like the appeal of it. It was like a broader comedy, and I still find it funny to this day. But that's not really what the one scene they have is about, like the hobbits, where the hobbits gay, and that was like, this is right after Lord of the Rings won their Oscar.
I think it's funny too because in a lot of ways that kind of mirrors Clerks' use of Star Wars, where like they went for the biggest like nerd trilogy you could, which works because those are huge movies that more than just the people who talk about it saw. And that's really what you need for those type of jokes. And I think that's part of the reason that stuff works too, is like everyone had seen Lord of the Rings who watched movies. Yeah. Like it didn't matter if you were a big dork. But it's almost more effective because you get this weird thing where the people who do have discussions like this think it's funny because they're watching someone else have these discussions and they can relate to it. And then you probably have a portion of the audience, I assume, I've never been part of this portion of the audience, that just thinks it's funny because they've never thought of anything like that.
That was my perspective too. Like I never thought the hobbits were gay or anything. I was like, wow. And then the other guy got so mad about it, and it was like, that's where the comedy came from for me. Because like I didn't really have those nerdy friends that would talk about like Lord of the Rings or anything, and like hearing that was kind of like my introduction to all of that. And it was such a weird conversation. So like how I saw Clerks 2 is probably how a lot of people saw Clerks 1, which is a gulf of differences there. Like for one has color and the other doesn't.
But another pretty good success, brings back a lot of those View Askew characters, and sets Dante and Randall into another set. But I think nothing too deep. A lot of people are really into the end because it shows like Randall and Dante finally, like, I guess, growing up in a way, and it's fun. I don't have a lot of emotional attachment to it, no matter how many times I see it.
Yeah, I mean, neither do I, but again, I have a very different like cultural context for these guys. Like this is my introduction. They're leaving. I'm like, oh, all right, that's fine. I don't need to see them again.
After Clerks 2 in 2006, Smith once again breaks off of View Askew, kind of. We'll get back to that in a minute, and goes with a film called Zack and Miri Make a Porno. A bigger budget, 24 million, but also does pretty well at the box office. Seth Rogen, Elizabeth Banks, Craig Robinson, and then famous for other types of films, Tracy Lords and Katie Morgan also joined that cast.
It's interesting because this is kind of like trying to be like a Chasing Amy of like the mid 2000s, but it just doesn't work as well to me because it hits a lot of the same beats as Chasing Amy, right? Where it's these two people that don't think they're in love and they actually are in love with each other. But you don't have that really like complex romance side to it, or it doesn't feel as messy as Chasing Amy does either. And in a lot of ways, this is just Kevin Smith's way of writing a 90-minute movie about weird porno titles.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, it just doesn't have the same validity that Chasing Amy ends up with. I don't think it's trying to, though. I think those similarities are just sort of instinctual when you're writing. That's how you're going to kind of structure it. It is funny. It does do pretty well. It definitely seems like it takes place in like the same type of world as the other ones, which we'll get back into in a second too. But yeah, it's funny. It doesn't really hold the weight of the other ones. I think it's partially because he's not fighting as much to get your attention. He has Seth Rogen and Elizabeth Banks there. They're going to bring people into the theater. They're funny. He can kind of let them go a little bit.
Well, it has a lot of boobs in it too.
Yeah, and that's always good. I mean,
it has porno in the title. It's just, everything about it is just trying to grab you into the seat and be like, what could this possibly be?
Unless you buy it at some retailers where it's just called Zack and Miri.
Is that real?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. But it is, as you were saying, it has that element of exploitation. And I think one of the most genius things that I've heard in the last few years is from the Netflix Glow series is what do you want in storytelling is blood, tits, and storytelling.
I mean, he has all three in that.
He definitely has them there. I mean, there's not a lot of blood, but
oh yeah,
you got to turn stuff up and down as you go. But once again, a pretty good movie that gets pretty well received. So here he comes again, back into bigger budget. Warner Brothers Pictures, $30 million budget for Bruce Willis and Tracy Morgan in Cop Out.
I mean, I appreciate the good humor Kevin Smith has about this, where he still makes fun of himself about this day. I mean, this is also an incredibly mercenary production for him. He was literally like a gun for hire. He did not care about this.
Yeah, he also had a lot of problems with Bruce Willis, which is explained in detail in the Evenings with Kevin Smith, which is good because Kevin Smith is very good at taking his experiences that don't work out and making money off of them somehow. Which I think is I think he's a genius on that level. Is like there is no failure. There is only the next thing to make money off of. Yeah, it's really not good, and you can't. He did get the edit on it, but he didn't write the script. It was supposed to be based off of a comic called A Couple of Dicks, which would have been a way better title for a Kevin Smith movie to come out, and I think would have gotten way more attention.
Yeah, but like from what I just said, like Bruce Willis would not be willing to do a movie called A Couple of Dicks.
I don't know. I don't know. When I saw Bruce Willis at Universal Studios Hollywood that one time and he nodded at me, I felt really good about
it. It just feels like everything about this movie, people are here for just a paycheck.
Yeah, it's yeah, I don't think we really need to talk about it much, right?
No. Kevin Smith talks about it enough.
I think the important thing about Cop Out is that it seems to put that final nail in the coffin for Kevin Smith, like giving a shit about working for studios ever again.
Yeah, I would agree because after this he veers way off course with like a bunch of really I don't want to say experimental, but very like weird movies. Like experimental to me is like Eraserhead or something. But these are much more like him playing in different ponds, I guess I would say in a shitty metaphor.
And through all of this, there's something that we're not going to get super into. You got to remember too, Kevin Smith is popping up, cameoing, he's hosting things, he's really keeping what becomes his brand relevant. There are short films in there. You were talking about the Clerks TV show, which is like Simpsons for View Askew. It's really good. I think that's an episode in itself, though.
Yeah, because he has a million podcasts. Fat Man with the Batman. Uh,
Yeah, and it's just all of this is all going on so he's really keeping his name out there.
yeah, but like the things he does are still like very niche in a way. Like he's doing a million different projects, but they're mainly for his fan base and everything. They're not trying to like step outside of those boundaries because it is him like talking about comic books or movie culture or things like that. It's not him trying to like gather new fans. I guess I would say, which isn't a bad thing. Like this is him like playing to his base at this point, and even him writing these comic books and everything too.
Yeah, big run on Daredevil, Green Arrow, a couple of Batman miniseries. He's very much around. I think the first sort of contemporary Kevin Smith film, as weird as that sounds, is from 2011, the first of the Smodcast films. This is after he started his very successful podcast venture, is Red State, which
Yeah,
is another big left turn for Smith.
I enjoyed this movie a lot. I have some grievances about the ending, but I get why he did it. I saw this in college, basically at the IFC Center in New York City, for a live screening where he wasn't there, but he was streaming from I think LA or something, and he had the biggest hockey jersey possible, and and it was like a live stream with like a bunch of YouTube comments, so everyone was talking about his jersey at that point. That's something I would distinctly remember. I really like this film too because it is a very tense film. Right up until the end, until like about the last 15 minutes.
Yeah, and it's cool because it's almost like he started to play with the religious elements in Dogma, and Red State's like a religious horror movie, which are always, if they're done well, are effective because anything that your audience feels like they can't control is scary. It's like the basis of all horror movies is that you can't. The second that the villain is or the threat is controllable, you've turned it into an action movie, which
Right.
tends to happen with like later slashers. Having like a high concept like this where this could literally be, the end of the world, I think serves it really well. It's not my favorite of his films, but I certainly enjoyed it.
No, yeah, I really enjoyed it too. I mean, this is coming out at a time where like the Westboro Baptist Church were like a really big thing, and now they're basically bankrupt. And it was him like attacking that in a very visceral way.
Yeah,
And
and it's very different too. That's a good point because that was very much on everyone's mind at the time. And it was a big news item, and he does play that very well. This idea of like these cultists out there who could turn on society at any point.
right, and playing with Waco and everything too. Like that's why I really liked it because it just reminded me about all these other like not reminded me, but it pulled reference from a lot of other events that happened across the United States.
And it builds up his confidence a lot, I think, as a director of other types of film. Because following that, but not super closely, he's working on a lot of other projects. 2014, we get Tusk, which is a hell of a movie.
Yeah, it's I remember the advertising for this because my friend really wanted to see it because he was like, I don't know what it's about, but I just know as a man that turns into a walrus, and I want to see it because of that. But then I think he saw the reviews. He's like, no, I'm staying away from it. I mean, he was really picky about his movies too, so it was probably for the best.
Yeah, the whole plot came from an article discussed on the Smodcast with Scott Mosier of someone offering a free boarding in their home for someone who would dress as a walrus, and they eventually held a vote over whether this should be a film, and it was voted on affirmatively. Uh, I really like Tusk. I think it's that right type of ridiculous where it's creepy because it's just so bizarre. You have Michael Parks, the late Michael Parks, as the weirdo who wants to turn someone into a walrus. You have Justin Long as this like shitty podcast host, which I think is funny because Kevin Smith, like, he's always kind of writing about himself, but all writers are always kind of writing about themselves. It's a bad criticism. I always point it out because every writer does it. Like, I do it. Like, if you write a story, you're writing about yourself in some capacity. There's nothing you can do. So, like, he's probably like, I think he took himself and made himself like the worst person he possibly could be. Haley Joel Osment in there too, who plays the less shitty podcast host, but who's also sleeping with Justin Long's girlfriend. It's a whole thing, but it's a cool story. It all kind of meshes. It seems a little more serious at the beginning, then you start getting into it, and you meet a new signature character for Kevin Smith, portrayed by someone who you would not think would be working with Kevin Smith at this point in their career.
This is also the beginning of what he called it, the Canadian North trilogy. There's still one more film that's to come.
The True North trilogy.
True North trilogy.
Which we are still waiting on the final one. We'll get closer to that. So we have this whole concept of someone getting kidnapped, being turned to a walrus. Sorry, I just blew it. But
it's the first 15 minutes of the film, but it's probably the most engaging 15 minutes of the film to me.
Absolutely, and I think it's also it also, like I said, it gets wackier and wackier as it goes, and I don't dislike that, because what the hell are you going to do with that plot if it doesn't get wackier?
I mean, I compare it a lot to the Human Centipede, because that's what happens in the Human Centipede too. Like in the first 15 minutes, you have the Human Centipede, and the rest of the film is about the Human Centipede.
Right.
But where it falls apart for me is like them investigating where the walrus is, and it's like, I just do not care about like these other characters. I just don't. Like it pulls so much away from the more interesting thing about the Walrus Man.
We do get Guy Lapointe, portrayed by Johnny Depp, who is our new connecting character for the True North trilogy. We also briefly run into the teenage convenience store workers who will later pop up. But it's fun. I really like Tusk. It did not do well for the record, though it has built a pretty good following after the fact. It did not. It was only a $3 million budget. It made just shy of $2 million at the box office, so not good. But I think it did more. This is like what we were saying with Smith, is those type of failures almost seem to not matter, because it just expands his brand more and more.
Well, I think he treats it like a lot of Hollywood producers should treat it. It's like, well, that didn't work, but the next thing will work. He's always looking forward.
And looking forward from Tusk is the second film in the True North trilogy that is yet to be completed, Yoga Hosers. Quite a Canadian name.
I just don't get this film.
Yeah, Yoga Hosers, if Tusk is weird, Yoga Hosers is incomprehensible. But it is funny. You get Guy Lapointe back, you get Harley Quinn Smith, his daughter, and Lily Rose Depp playing the two teenage convenience store workers who take the lead in this one. But you also get Jennifer Swalbach Smith back as Missy from Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, which then completely ties the True North trilogy back into the Views universe.
Yes, the canon is all connecting.
It's a lot of connecting. I'm not going to go through much here as far as the plot, because oh boy. But
it's like something about a Nazi scientist, and that's all I really gathered from it.
Yeah, there's a Canadian Führer, there's the Canadian Nazi Party. It does. Here's this. Turn this off for a second if you are going to watch this regardless. But if you want a reason to watch it, there are at one point mutated small sausage people called the Bratzies. That's it. That's the reason to watch it, I think.
Yeah, that was shown in the promotional stuff a lot.
Okay, good. Yeah. There was promotional stuff?
I remember like a trailer, and they had a lot of the Sprotzies.
Yeah. The Colleen, by the way, are the two young Canadian convenience store workers, and they're also going to continue through. I guess they're going to be the ones that show up in all three to truly tie it together, because it does not. From what I see from Moose Jaws here, I don't see a reference to Guy Lapointe being in there.
Well, it's a lot of people also like criticize the acting in this movie, and I don't really understand why, because I think the acting, it works. Like, yeah, I don't think the acting is the problem. Like people say, like, oh, the two main actresses are not good actors. And I'm kind of like, why? What's the problem here? Like, have you not seen Clerks 1? Like, I don't get the criticism.
With that. I think if you're going to criticize, like, high-level performances, you're looking at the wrong stuff. Yeah. It's not intended to be that. It's supposed to be a comedic Canadian horror trilogy.
This one is a bit more like 80s slasher.
Yeah, a little bit. And to go even further into that, the next one, which is not out yet, and it does not seem to be in production from what I could see, is going to be Moose Jaws, which is essentially going to be Jaws with a moose. And I could not be happier with that. Same year that Yoga Hosers comes out, Smith also contributes to the horror anthology Holidays with his Halloween segment. He does write, edit, direct that. It's pretty good. I don't know exactly where it's available at this time. Maybe we can figure that out and put that into the description. But Holidays is pretty solid. I don't know if you've seen that. Yeah, it's a cool little anthology movie. We're getting a lot of those now with a lot of this sort of direct to streaming horror. We're getting a lot of anthologies again. It's a good opportunity for directors kind of get in there. And my understanding is that Smith, heard of the concept and thought it was just really cool and wanted to be part of it. And he gets Halloween, so that's really the star of any holiday-driven horror anthology, I would say.
Yeah, it's the most flexible of them, I would say.
Last year, using a touring system, which is pretty cool. And then I think there was a limited release as well. We got what is the most current iteration of the View Askew universe, Jay and Silent Bob Reboot.
So the Jay and Silent Bob Reboot is basically a parody of all Hollywood movies right now. Not a direct parody, but mainly just mocking them. That's kind of the point of this film. And then I do appreciate that he takes time to try to find an emotional center for Jay and Silent Bob somewhere in all of this mess, because it is cartoony as hell.
Yeah, I like that aspect of it. I think if anything, you can consider it very much a direct sequel to Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. You get almost every major character from the View Askew universe. Otherwise, we even get back Loki from Dogma, which is really cool. We'll just, here, if you haven't watched it, stop right now. Okay, did you stop? You stopped. All right. You get Affleck back. You get Matt Damon back. You get Joey Lauren Adams back. It just felt very good. It's fun to watch.
Yeah, it was great seeing all these little cameos from all these past films show up there for since the original films, really. And then you even get Chris Hemsworth and everything. Is probably his biggest cast. I mean, a lot of the times you can kind of tell it's oh, come by for a day and we'll shoot for 2 hours and you're done. But still, I'm glad he got these cameos.
Yeah, and there's a lot of cool stuff. You get. You know what I won't ruin, even for the people who continue listening who haven't seen it? I'm not going to ruin who the rebooted Blunt Man is. Because that's terrific. But you do get, and it's nice little nods to the current state of the industry. You get Melissa Benoist as the new Chronic, TV's Supergirl, who I think, I'll be honest with you, I don't know a single straight male nerd who doesn't have a crush on her. She's just adorable. You get a lot of your callbacks to the other movies, which it's all fan service. But the thing about this that's great is it's an entire movie of fan service, so you can't criticize the fan service because it's all that exists.
Yeah, and it's the right kind of fan service. Whereas you're expecting, and you get it. You get it in spade. It's what you want and it's what you got.
Yeah, it's just a really fun ride. It hits you the way it's supposed to, which is just completely goofy. And I think it's really funny because you were talking about log lines, and so when asked what Jay and Silent Bob Reboot was, he said it's literally the same fucking movie all over again. Which I really love, because that's a wonderful self-awareness from Kevin Smith right there. Because it's both part of the plot is that they're rebooting the Blunt Man and Chronic franchise that we first saw in Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. Which I also love the fact that they have groups of fans who hate that there's a reboot because they love the original so much.
Yeah, then the reboot is a Zack Snyder reboot that a lot of fans really love. They're oh, it's serious for once now. Or and then them actually going across country and trying to figure this out, and they're pointing out all the weird reboot things they do now in Hollywood movies, a more diverse cast and everything.
Like I said, beautifully self-aware on so many levels and just fun. Don't overthink it. He doesn't want you to overthink it. He wasn't overthinking it when he wrote it. It's the reason we never got Mallrats 2 and Clerks 3 is this is where we ended up, and we should just admit that. And Mallrats 2 and Clerks 3 apparently had script. Oh, before we forget too, in Jay and Silent Bob Reboot, they finally tie in Zack and Miri to the View Askew universe. Justin Long's Brandon St. Randy ends up being the lawyer for Jay and Silent Bob when they get screwed over.
Oh yeah, I didn't even make that connection.
Yeah, they can't say it, I think, character-wise, because there's still issues with that. But I mean, it's obviously him if you've seen the movie. Up next for Kevin Smith is a comedy horror anthology film called Kilroy Was Here. One of the big jumps from that is we got Chris Jericho in another role that I don't want to ruin in Jay and Silent Bob reboot. He's going to be jumping onto that as well with a lot of other Kevin Smith regulars onto this. Not much out there about what's going on outside of it being based around that general myth around the Kilroy graffiti.
But I look forward to it. Like it's hard not to look forward to a Kevin Smith film because even if you don't like it, it'll be something interesting at the very least.
I'm trying to see, like even if there's a little bit, there was a trailer shown, but not widely released. It seems like this is probably something that's going to come out. Who knows with the environment right now? Like we're recording this while being stuck in our homes. This could go streaming really quickly. It could get a small theatrical release. It could do something like they did with Jay and Silent Bob's reboot, where he toured with it. Like we said, this kind of stuff doesn't seem to affect Kevin Smith all that much.
No, I mean he still has his podcast running. He's still doing well. Allegedly, I mean he could still be writing a million scripts. He's kind of a workaholic, really. Like he's always working on something, and I'm excited to look forward to his Masters of the Universe series, whatever that may turn out to be.
Yeah, from the most recent stuff, it's very much sounding like it is going to be a direct sequel to the original show, but taking it somewhat seriously. For big Masters of the Universe fans, there was like some debate over what was going on. There's a bunch of different interpretations of that. As weird as that is, the Masters of the Universe Classics toy line did the best job of kind of condensing everything into one timeline. But this sounds like it's going to pick up more from the original cartoon than anything else.
Well, it has nothing to do with the original, not the original, the current She-Ra that's going on, which is interesting because that's been pretty popular.
Yeah, and it seems to ignore New Adventures of He-Man.
I mean, most people do.
I did not. I had that sword.
Oh, you did?
Yeah,
I'm
I
just
had the
saying because
sword. I
like,
had like 2 VHSs that came out.
wow, that's the first person I heard because like I from what I just that did not do commercially well.
It did not do commercially well. I just like He-Man.
I think overall Kevin Smith is like a really interesting director to look at because he started out so small and he kind of has retained that same size fan base since then. And he stepped out of that a couple of times, but it was never really like into a big hit though.
Yeah, I think his impact is really interesting. Like we were saying, like a lot of, that attention he got early on comes from the fact that he was doing, like references to really like nerdy stuff, like comic book stuff, and it built a fan base. And then like you were saying, he gets those spikes and it's like he sustains himself through those spikes because he's now this like name. Like even if you don't really know what he's talking about, you know who his audience is. It's really interesting.
Right, and I think like a lot of like not a lot of people talk about like his film techniques, but like him driving all these early dialogue heavy films, I think influenced a lot of people later down the line. Even though you don't see that influence much anymore, but that's just because the market changed so much. Like Tarantino had a bigger impact, but like I think the way Kevin Smith wrote about pop culture allowed a new generation to rise. Like this is how we discuss pop culture now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think that he was a huge inspiration, like to a few generations who were into comics and stuff. That you could turn this into something that you wouldn't have to work with like the smallest audience possible to get your work seen. Like he's proven that through a lot of hard work, and from everything I've ever heard, he's a really nice guy. That you know that sort of vigor for trying to get things done is as important as anything else.
Yeah, but I've never heard a bad story about him, oddly enough. Like, you hear a lot of bad stories from other directors, but everyone seems to really like working with Kevin Smith, and that's why, he can still get, like, Matt Damon to cameo in some of his films and things like that, even though he's probably insanely busy.
It's not about what you know, it's who you know. But Kevin Smith knows a lot too. He's a good
Yeah.
director. I don't have a problem with Kevin. I think some people are very harsh on him, but I also think that a lot of times people aren't really looking at what he's trying to accomplish through the film.
Right, like, he's not trying to make these, like, Scorsese films where there's all these cinematography and everything in it. He's just trying to make, like, very down to earth, raw films. where it's just like the daily life of a bunch of nerds. Like, half of his films about people working in like shitty dead end jobs, like a fast food restaurant or a convenience store or like a coffee shop.
Or alternatively, something so ridiculous that you can't even judge it on like a regular scale.
Yeah, no. Like, what scale do you just tux on? The only example I can come up with is like, again, Human Centipede, and that's not a normal film.
So what we established here is Kevin Smith might be the most resilient creative of the last 25 years. Just unstoppable, always making something, and for the most part, I've always watched it.
This is an insane amount of content from one man. I mean, it is not just one man. It's like him and his entire production staff and everything. But he like lifted a lot of people's career from like nowhere too.
Yeah, he absolutely, like, regardless of your opinion of his films, an incredibly important figure in like pop culture and filmmaking in the last 25 years. Helping bringing guys like Ben Affleck to the forefront. Like, you can't deny the impact that he's had. Well, I think that pretty much brings us to the end of this episode. As always, you can follow us on assorted social medias. Just type in Dissecting Fiction. We're on all the big ones, as we are on most major podcast platforms. In these tough times, we're especially big on our partnership with ToyStoreGuide.com. A lot of these stores are doing a lot of mail order, doing online sales. Please check them out. We want to keep comic book and toy stores alive across the country.
A lot of stores are going through really hard time right now.
If you like this episode, or if you didn't like this episode, just rate us really highly. However you do that, thumbs up, follow, 5 stars, tweet us. I want to make a little initiative there. If you listen to this and you tweet, why don't you tweet the episode out? See who picks up on it. Put a couple hashtags on it. Social experiment here. We're getting hit pretty hard by a lot of the new algorithms on social media. So anything you could do to help us promote, we'd really appreciate it.
Yes, please. I mean, we would try to figure out the algorithm, but then they would change it.
Yeah, no, we have. We were doing good for a little bit. Once again, thank you guys for listening. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And we'll see you next time.